The ferry's horn groaned, a sound like a dying beast across the slate-gray water. Dean watched the mainland shrink, its familiar contours blurring into the haze. He felt no pang of regret, only a hollow ache that had become his constant companion since the loss. The world he knew had fractured, and he, a cartographer by trade, now sought to redraw the map of his own shattered existence on a place as remote and unforgiving as his grief. This island, a jagged tooth jutting from the ocean, was meant to be his blank page. The journey had been long, a string of anonymous roads and cold, indifferent faces. Now the small, battered vessel churned through choppy waves, carrying him towards the only inheritance his estranged grandfather had left him, a lighthouse keeper's cottage on a forgotten rock. He gripped the worn canvas of his duffel bag, the knuckles of his hands white. The salt spray tasted of rust and oblivion, stinging his eyes. The boatman, a man whose face seemed carved from the very granite of the island, offered no conversation, only grunts and curt nods. His gaze, when it met Dean's, was deep-set and weary, carrying the weight of countless solitary voyages. Dean felt a peculiar scrutiny in that look, a silent assessment that went beyond the usual curiosity afforded to an outsider. He wondered if the boatman knew something, felt something, about the place Dean was headed. As they drew closer, the island emerged from the persistent fog like a bruised apparition. Craggy cliffs rose sheer from the churning water, topped by a sparse, wind-whipped expanse of moorland. Perched precariously on the highest point, the lighthouse stood sentinel, a stark white tower against the brooding sky. Below it, nestled into the lee of a rocky outcrop, was the cottage. It was exactly as he'd imagined, a place where time had forgotten to move. The boat finally nudged a barnacle-encrusted jetty, groaning against the impact. The air, heavy with the scent of brine and decaying seaweed, clung to Dean's clothes. He disembarked, his boots clattering on the slick stone, the boatman already securing the lines with practiced ease. Dean retrieved his few bags, the weight of familiar comfort against the vast emptiness within him. "You'll be wanting provisions," the boatman rumbled, his voice surprisingly deep. "Supply boat comes every 2 weeks. Next one's in 3 days." Dean nodded, a lump forming in his throat. 3 days. 3 days of absolute solitude before even the possibility of human contact. There was no warmth in the sentiment, only a grim finality. Then, with a turn of the engine, the boat pulled away, leaving Dean standing alone on the jetty, the rhythmic slosh of the waves the only sound. He began the ascent to the cottage, the path a narrow, winding track choked with tough, resilient weeds. The wind, a constant, mournful presence, tore at his hair and clothes, carrying the faint, earthy smell of damp soil and something else. Something metallic, like old blood, or perhaps just the sea's mineral tang. The cottage door was swollen with damp, refusing to yield easily. Dean put his shoulder into it, and with a protesting groan of ancient wood, it swung inward. The air inside was thick and stagnant, a cocktail of dust, mildew, and something else indefinable. A musty sweetness that made his stomach clench. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak light piercing the grimy windows. The furniture was sparse. A rickety table, 2 chairs, a narrow cot draped in a stained blanket. He ran a hand over the rough wooden table, picking up a fine layer of grit. He dropped his bags and began a cursory exploration. The kitchen was small, a rusted sink and a few empty cupboards. The bedroom held only the cot and a chest of drawers. As he moved, a subtle sound caught his ear. A faint, almost imperceptible scratching like claws on stone, coming from somewhere beneath the floorboards. He froze, listening intently. The sound vanished, replaced by the relentless sigh of the wind outside. He told himself it was just the house settling, the old timbers groaning. He found a loose floorboard near the fireplace, its edge splintered. Driven by a sudden, inexplicable urge, he knelt and pried it up. Beneath, nestled in a shallow cavity, was a rolled-up, oilskin-wrapped bundle. His grandfather, a man Dean barely remembered, had left it. This, then, was the true inheritance. His fingers, slightly trembling, unwrapped the oilskin. Inside lay a faded, salt-stained nautical chart of the island. His cartographer's mind, accustomed to precision and logic, found the additions deeply unsettling. His gaze followed a particularly dense cluster of markings that circled a prominent landmark on the island's northern reaches, the remote monastery. Around it, the lines twisted into a particularly grotesque knot, as if something was anchored there, or perhaps trapped. Beside the chart, acting as a crude paperweight, lay a small, smooth stone, impossibly black, its surface reflecting no light, absorbing it instead. Dean traced a finger over the strange symbols on the map, a shiver running down his spine. The scratching sound, he realized, had not been the house settling. It had been the sound of something waking. The first full day on the island was a study in profound silence. Dean had woken to the mournful cry of gulls and the relentless churn of the sea against the crags, sounds that were vast and indifferent. He spent the morning unpacking his maps and instruments, trying to impose order on the chaos of inherited belongings. The cottage, despite its desolate air, was sturdy, smelling faintly of salt, damp stone, and something else. A faint metallic tang he couldn't quite place. By afternoon, a thick fog had rolled in, swallowing the horizon and muffling the world. Dean stood at the lighthouse's base, the beams slicing through the gray veil, feeling the island breathe around him. The solitude he'd craved was now a tangible weight, pressing in from all sides. He found himself listening, not to the gulls or the waves, but to the spaces between them, as if waiting for a note that never came. It was later, as dusk bled into a starless night, that the sea began its odd performance. Dean had been staring out his window, a mug of cooling tea in his hands when he noticed it. The tide, which should have been steadily receding, instead surged. Not a single powerful wave, but a gradual, unnatural swell that climbed higher than he'd ever witnessed, creeping up the slick black rocks, tasting the very foundations of the cottage. The water hissed, a sound like an indrawn breath, as it clawed at the cliff face. He marked the waterline against a distinctive rock formation, then watched, transfixed, as it receded just as abruptly, pulling back further than normal, exposing slick, dark patches of seabed that should have remained submerged. It was an erratic, almost frantic dance. Dean, a man who understood the predictable rhythms of the world, felt a prickle of unease. He rationalized it as an extreme confluence of weather patterns, perhaps an offshore seismic event, something geological, something explainable. But the explanation felt thin, stretched. They weren't distinct words, not at first. Just a low, murmuring current woven into the wind that scraped against the window panes. It sounded like a multitude of hushed voices, distant and indistinct, carried on the salt-laden air. Dean dismissed it as the wind playing tricks through the cottage's ancient stone and timber, an auditory illusion born of isolation and the vast, empty space beyond his walls. He strained to catch a syllable, a meaning, but there was only the ceaseless, unsettling murmur. He needed a distraction, something concrete. He decided to tackle the small, cluttered study his grandfather had used, a room overflowing with nautical charts, navigational tools, and stacks of yellowed books. His fingers brushed against something solid, tucked deep beneath a coil of rope. He pulled it out. It was a journal, not like the others. The first few pages were water-stained to illegibility, the ink bleeding into indecipherable patterns. But further in, the entries grew clearer, though no less disturbing. His grandfather's handwriting, usually precise and neat, became erratic, sprawling across the page. One recurring motif was a series of concentric circles, radiating outwards like ripples from an unseen source, often accompanied by the phrase, "the deep song." The words were scrawled in the margins, sometimes underlined several times, sometimes almost scratched through with frantic energy. Dean's gaze snagged on a particular entry, dated years ago, describing an expedition to a remote monastery on the island's northern tip, a place he hadn't even known existed. The text spoke of ancient carvings found there, echoes of the primordial current, and warned of the pact broken, the slumber disturbed. His grandfather had written about listening, about hearing something in the deep, a resonant hum that vibrated not just through the water, through the very bone. It calls, the entry concluded, the ink almost tearing the page, and it demands its due. Dean's rational mind screamed. This was the rambling of an old man, isolated and perhaps succumbing to the onset of dementia. The sketches were fevered imaginings, the warnings the product of a mind unmoored. He tried to tell himself that. He held the water-damaged journal, its strange weight a testament to an untold history, and for the first time, felt truly, utterly alone. Dean's rational mind screamed. He needed to tell himself that. But the unnatural tides that had battered the cottage, the unsettling quiet of the island, and the chilling resonance of his grandfather's scrawled words had chipped away at that desperate self-assurance. He was a cartographer, a man of precise lines and verifiable data. But what if the map extended beyond the known, into depths unplottable? A grim resolve settled over him. Dismissing it outright felt like a coward's retreat, and Dean had never been one to shy from a challenge, even if this one felt like a phantom limb reaching for him from the deep. He needed facts, however disturbing. The island was small, isolated, but it would have a history, an oral tradition, something beyond his grandfather's increasingly manic entries. He started with the cottage itself, rummaging through dusty crates and forgotten nooks. Old fishing logs, weather-beaten charts, and a handful of local pamphlets offered little beyond basic maritime data. His grandfather's personal library, however, held a different kind of treasure. Tucked amongst navigation manuals and tide tables were several thick, leather-bound tomes, their pages brittle with age and their titles hand-lettered in faded ink. They spoke not of currents or constellations, but of local folklore, of the island's earliest settlers, and of strange, whispered legends. Dean devoured them, cross-referencing names and dates, searching for any mention of his grandfather's increasingly bizarre fixations. He found fragmented accounts of a sunken city, a place lost beneath the waves, sometimes described as a blessing, other times a curse. Ancient rites, vaguely pagan in nature, were alluded to, performed by the island's original inhabitants to appease the deep ones, or to ensure the bounty of the sea. The language was archaic, veiled in superstition, but the echoes of his grandfather's warnings resonated with unnerving clarity. One of the oldest tomes, a dense chronicle of the island's religious history, mentioned a collection of ancient texts housed at the remote monastery on the island's highest, most inaccessible peak. It was a place few visited, maintained by a small, reclusive order who had long ago ceased all communication with the outside world. The book suggested these texts contained records predating even the first documented settlements, preserving stories passed down through generations. The journey to the remote monastery was arduous. The path, barely more than a goat track, wound through dense, skeletal forests where the wind sighed like a lament. The monastery itself was a squat, formidable structure of gray stone, ancient and weathered, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the turbulent sea. A robed figure, silent and gaunt, met him at the heavy oak door. Dean explained his cartographic interest, his desire to understand the island's deepest history. The elder listened, unblinking, then led him into a vast, echoing scriptorium. The air was thick with the scent of old parchment and cold stone. Here, among shelves laden with scrolls and codices, Dean found what he sought. Not maps, not charts, but illuminated manuscripts depicting strange, undulating forms beneath the waves, creatures with too many limbs and eyes. There were references to a binding, a pact of sustenance, and images of offerings made to the sea. He returned to the cottage as dusk bled across the sky, his head buzzing with a new, terrifying framework for understanding. He pulled out his grandfather's journal, his fingers trembling as he turned to the section he'd dismissed as lunacy. Not just the sea's roar, but something from it. A bargain struck long ago, a price. They promised sustenance, safety from the depths. But the debt accrues. The city stirs. It calls for what is owed. His grandfather, for all his isolation, had been piecing together a truth that defied all logic. A pact. A debt. A malevolent entity, dormant, but now awakening. That night, sleep offered no respite. He was submerged, not drowning, but part of the water, an extension of the vast, unseen ocean. Shapes, impossibly vast and formless, moved beyond the veil of his closed eyelids, their presence a silent, resonate hum that vibrated through his very bones. He saw the sunken city, not as ruins, but as a living, breathing, alien metropolis, its spires reaching towards him through the murky green, its architecture both grotesque and mesmerizing. A profound, ancient hunger emanated from its depths, a patient, insatiable demand. He woke with a gasp, his skin clammy, the scent of brine thick in his nostrils. The hum still echoed faintly in his ears. But then, he saw it. A luminescence, faint but unmistakable, pulsed from the damp stone of the cottage wall near the hearth. It wasn't moss, not lichen. It was a strange, iridescent growth, like a network of tiny, glowing veins spreading across the mortar. A bioluminescent algae, impossible, alien. It pulsed with a soft green-blue light, a miniature terrestrial echo of the sunken city he had just witnessed in his dreams. It wasn't just on the wall. A faint, shimmering film coated the rim of his grandfather's desk, and a few glowing specks clung to the edge of the journal itself. The island wasn't just holding a secret. It was actively manifesting it, seeping into the very fabric of his reality. The cold prickle from the previous night had not dissipated with the dawn. It clung to Dean like a shroud, a persistent whisper against his skin. His dreams, fragmented and unsettling, had left a residue of brackish water and guttural, echoing calls in his memory. He made coffee, the gurgle of the percolator a welcome, familiar sound against the unnatural quiet of the island. But even that small comfort was fleeting. It wasn't the wind, nor the groan of the old house settling. This was a deeper thrum, a vibration that seemed to originate from beneath the floorboards, a sound that resonated in his chest cavity rather than his ears. It pulsed, slow and deliberate, like a colossal, unseen heart beating in the earth beneath him. Dean paused, his hand halfway to his mouth with the mug. He listened, straining. He dismissed it as an inner ear disturbance, a consequence of the strange dreams. But then, as he turned to set the mug down, he saw it. The old brass compass, usually resting perfectly still on the mantelpiece, was spinning erratically, its needle whirling in frantic, meaningless circles, despite the lack of any magnetic interference he could perceive. He reached out, his fingers brushing the cool metal. As soon as he touched it, the needle shuddered, then snapped back to north, as if it had simply been momentarily confused. He stared at the compass, a knot tightening in his stomach. He picked it up, examined it, but found nothing amiss. He set it back down, carefully aligning it. The hum returned, softer this time, a gentle, insistent vibration that seemed to wrap around him. He peered into the glass, studying his tired eyes, the faint lines etched around them. For a fraction of a second, the reflection wavered. The skin rippled like water, distorting his nose, elongating his jaw into something gaunt and unnatural. He blinked, hard, and the image snapped back into place, his own weary face staring back. He couldn't ignore it any longer. His grandfather's notes, the cryptic warnings, the talk of a pact. It all coalesced into a terrifying, undeniable truth. There was something here, in this cottage, on this island, and it was no longer content to simply lurk in the periphery. It was reaching out. He moved from room to room, his hands running over every surface, his eyes scanning for anything out of place. He remembered his grandfather's meticulous nature, his tendency to hide things in plain sight. Inside, nestled amongst dried seaweed and strangely carved pieces of bone, was a worn, leather-bound journal. The pages were filled with his grandfather's spidery handwriting, dense with observations, sketches, and what appeared to be ritualistic symbols. Some pages detailed frantic attempts to decipher ancient texts, referencing knowledge gleaned from a remote monastery that held forgotten lore of the deep. One entry, scrawled in thick, desperate strokes, mentioned a sacrifice, a debt paid to ensure a temporary reprieve. Had his grandfather been feeding something? A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the living room. Dean dropped the journal, his head snapping up. The hum, which had been a low thrum, now intensified, vibrating through the very floorboards beneath his feet. He moved cautiously, the journal clutched in his hand, his heart hammering against his ribs. He reached the living room doorway and froze. The air was thick, heavy, tasting of salt and something metallic like old pennies. It wasn't flat, like a mere absence of light. It had depth, a liquid shifting quality that seemed to absorb the ambient light, yet shimmered with an inner viscous gleam. It coalesced, rising from the floor like an unholy geyser, forming a vaguely humanoid shape, tall and gaunt, yet utterly amorphous. Dean couldn't move. The hum was deafening now, vibrating through his teeth, rattling his bones. It moved with an unnatural speed, yet seemed to flow, not walk. He could feel the pressure of it, a tangible weight in the room. He caught a glimpse of something within its depths, a fleeting, indescribable glint, like 1,000 tiny eyes reflecting starlight from the bottom of the ocean. He tasted bile in his mouth. Just as it was about to touch his cheek, Dean let out a strangled cry, a primal sound torn from his throat. He lurched backward, tripping over his own feet, crashing to the floor. The journal flew from his grasp, sliding across the worn rug. The hum faded, leaving Dean gasping for breath, sprawled on the floor, his body trembling uncontrollably. He pushed himself up, scrambling backward until his back hit the wall, his eyes fixed on the spot where the entity had been. He was no longer alone on this island. He was being hunted. He had woken to the distinct feeling of being watched, a sensation that made the hairs on his arms stand erect, even in the pale light filtering through the grimy window panes. It was a sound that resonated deep within his chest, a frequency that felt almost wrong. The journal lay open on the kitchen table, a silent challenge. He'd spent hours poring over the faded script, trying to make sense of the increasingly disjointed entries. His grandfather's hand had grown shakier in the later pages, the ink often smudged, as if written in haste or distress. Below them, a fragmented sentence. The pact must be honored. The song must be contained. Contained. The word echoed in Dean's mind. His grandfather hadn't merely been observing. He had been active. He remembered the strange, almost ceremonial layout of some of the artifacts in the study, the meticulous order of the dusty tomes. It wasn't just a recluse's eccentricities. It was the precision of a warden. His grandfather's scrawled hand described a journey years prior to a remote monastery on the mainland, a place of crumbling stone and forgotten texts. He'd found his answers there, or so he believed, in the dusty, forbidden lore. The journal detailed specific intervals, astronomical alignments, and a peculiar list of offerings. Not objects, Dean realized with a jolt, but actions. Specific, repetitive actions tied to the lighthouse's operation. The constant turning of the lens, the meticulous maintenance, the rhythmic beam sweeping the waves. It wasn't just navigation. It was a ritual. The low thrum intensified, growing from a distant vibration to a pressure against his eardrums. The words on the page seemed to swim, the ink blurring, reforming into patterns that writhed like kelp in a tide. Dean blinked, rubbing his temples. He was tired, he told himself. Exhaustion was playing tricks. He read on, his determination warring with a rising tide of nausea. The deep song, as his grandfather called it, was not just a sound, it was a force. It seeks entry, an entry read, through the mind, through the cracks in reality. The light holds it back, but the song is its key. Dean felt his own mind begin to fray, the edges of his thoughts blurring. He closed his eyes, pressing his palms against his ears, but the thrum was internal now, vibrating behind his eyeballs. He opened them again. He gasped, stumbling back, knocking over a chair. It clattered to the floor, the sudden noise jarring his back to the mundane reality of his small kitchen. He was losing his grip. This was what his grandfather had endured. This was the deep song. A particular drawing caught his eye then, a schematic of the lighthouse itself, but with an added, crude annotation. A spiral staircase leading down, below the foundation, marked with a single, unsettling word. Crypt. Dean's breath hitched. He had explored the lighthouse, or so he thought. The ground floor, the winding stairs to the lantern room. But below? He hadn't found any such entrance. He grabbed the lantern, its light flickering nervously. The thrumming grew louder, a palpable presence now, urging him, drawing him. He felt a terrible certainty that whatever lay beneath, his grandfather had used it for his ritual. He moved to the small, stone-flagged antechamber at the base of the lighthouse tower, the place where the spiral stairs began their ascent. The journal had mentioned a keystone, a turning point. His fingers brushed against a section of the wall that felt slightly different, a faint indentation. He pressed, pushed, pulled, his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the deep, resonant hum that now filled the entire structure. A gust of stale, earthy air, heavy with the scent of damp rock and something indescribably ancient, brushed against his face. Dean held the lantern high, its beam swallowed almost immediately by the gloom. The deep song roared in his ears, an almost unbearable symphony now. He knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he had just found the heart of his grandfather's secret, the true altar of his desperate, forgotten pact. He took a single, trembling step forward. The schematic, crude as it was, had etched itself into Dean's mind. Crypt. The word vibrated with a forgotten dread, a silent hum beneath the surface of the island. He had scoured the lighthouse from base to lens, convinced the secret lay within its familiar walls. The drawing was not just of his lighthouse. It was a symbolic representation, a key. Another, older journal, tucked away beneath a loose floorboard in his grandfather's study, revealed the true destination. A place of ancient, forgotten stone, shrouded in the island's deepest mists. A remote monastery. The journey was a punishment, a penance for his relentless curiosity. The island, usually a defiant guardian against the sea, seemed to turn hostile. The fog, a constant companion on the island, thickened here, coiling around the skeletal trees like pale serpents, reducing visibility to a few uncertain yards. Each step was a plunge into the unknown. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else. A faint, metallic tang that prickled the back of his throat. Hours bled into an eternity. His legs ached, his lungs burned, yet Dean pushed on, driven by a determination that bordered on obsession. The images from his grandfather's journals, the cryptic warnings, The fragmented sketches of impossible geometries pulsed behind his eyes. Then, through a sudden thinning in the swirling vapor, it emerged. The remote monastery was not a ruin, not exactly, but a structure caught in a perpetual state of decay. Dean approached cautiously, his boots crunching on scattered debris, fallen roof tiles, wind-worn planks. It carried the faint, unsettling odor of stagnant water and something indescribably ancient, like dust from a forgotten star. He found the entrance almost by accident, a heavy, iron-bound door set into a section of wall that seemed too solid, too seamless. He pressed against it, then pushed harder, his shoulder aching. With a groan that echoed through the entire structure, the stone shifted inward, revealing a gap barely wide enough for him to squeeze through. He slid into absolute blackness. The air inside was thick and still, tasting of mineral and deep earth. It descended steeply, each step slick with condensation. The descent was unnervingly long, the spiral winding tighter and tighter, pulling him down into the earth like a corkscrew. He felt the weight of the rock above him, an immense, suffocating presence. The staircase finally ended, opening into a vast, cavernous space. His flashlight beam struggled against the immensity, revealing only fragments of impossible architecture. The angles of the chamber seemed wrong, subtly distorted, as if the very geometry of the space defied normal perception. It was an artifact, but not one of human make. It pulsed with a faint internal light, a deep, bruised violet that seemed to absorb rather than emit illumination. It was irregular in form, a cluster of crystalline growths that shifted and rippled like deep-sea anemones, yet was hard and unyielding to the eye. The surface was not smooth, but faceted with innumerable impossible angles, each catching the violet glow and refracting it in ways that made Dean's vision swim. It hummed with a low, resonant thrum, a sound that vibrated not in his ears, but in his bones, a deep, primordial chord. It was a doorway, a tear in the fabric of existence, a direct connection to something immeasurably ancient. As Dean stared, the violet light intensified and the hum deepened, filling the chamber, filling his head. Images flooded his mind, unbidden, terrifying in their clarity. He saw the island, not as a familiar landmass, but as a small, insignificant pebble adrift in an endless, lightless ocean. It was not malevolent in the human sense, but utterly indifferent, a colossal, primordial consciousness whose awakening was merely a slow, inevitable exhalation. The vision sharpened. He saw the island, slowly, irrevocably, dissolving. Not crumbling, but unraveling, its very molecular structure shifting, becoming fluid, then something else entirely. Something that writhed and pulsed with the same bruised violet light as the artifact. His own body, in the vision, was no longer solid, but a collection of shifting, indistinct forms, merging with the encroaching tide. A primal fear clawed at Dean's throat. This was a threat to being. The island, his refuge, was merely a nascent growth, a temporary anomaly on the surface of something vast and terrible. The air in the cottage, usually thick with the scent of salt and damp wood, now carried a faint, cloying sweetness, like decay hidden beneath blooming nightshade. He gripped the journal, his knuckles white, the worn leather feeling suddenly alive, pulsing faintly against his palm. He wasn't alone. The realization settled over him with the weight of a lead shroud. He flinched, jerking his head from side to side, but the small, familiar room was empty. Yet the presence was undeniable, a subtle pressure, like the deep-sea current against the hull of a sunken ship. It was trying to get in, not just into the room, but into him. A low hum began, a vibration that resonated in his teeth, a soundless drone that burrowed beneath the skin. It wasn't external, it was internal. A dissonant chord struck within his own cranial cavity. His vision blurred at the edges, the familiar lines of the cottage warping, stretching, then snapping back into place. The journal, heavy and insistent, was the only anchor he had. He flipped through the brittle pages, his gaze frantic, searching for any mention of the crypt, the monastery, anything that could explain this suffocating invasion. His grandfather's cramped script, once a source of comfort, now seemed to twist and writhe, each word a veiled warning. He found it, buried deep within a section marked Observations, the Deepening. The handwriting grew more frantic here. The ink smudged, as if the old man had been writing in a desperate haste. The veil thins, the ancient hunger stirs, it reaches. I feel its tendrils in my thoughts, in the very air I breathe. It seeks a vessel, it seeks to manifest. The pact, it calls for its due. Dean's breath hitched. A vessel, manifest. The hum intensified, vibrating through his entire skeleton. He stumbled, catching himself on the rough-hewn table, the lamp clattering but not extinguishing. He needed to find a way to stop it. Further down the page, scribbled almost illegibly, was a diagram. Not a map, but a ritualistic symbol, a complex knot of lines and circles surrounding a single stark word, seal. Beneath it, more text, each word a hammer blow to Dean's fraying composure. The seal must be renewed, at the place of the old pact, the remote monastery. It is the nexus, the wound in the world. The crypt beneath holds the key and the cost. He swallowed, his throat dry and tight. It was real, and it was the heart of this nightmare. He remembered the crumbling stone walls, barely visible through the perpetual mist on the island's northernmost point. The seal demands a life. Not merely a life, but a willing surrender. A binding, the blood of the line. A soul offered freely, bound to the depths to keep the portal shut. Only then will it sleep. For a time. A life. A willing surrender. Dean's grandfather had written it, his own ancestor, outlining a sacrifice so profound, so utterly devastating, that it stole the air from Dean's lungs. He was the last of his line on the island. The implications were a crushing weight. He pressed his hands against his temples, trying to push the noise out, to reclaim his own thoughts. The ritual was incomplete, missing key components, but the core demand was sickeningly clear. A sacrifice. A terrible, soul-rending sacrifice. His grandfather had known this. Had he intended for Dean to find this, to follow in his footsteps? Dean looked around the small cottage, once his sanctuary, now a cage where the walls felt like they were pressing in, the air thick with an unseen presence. He was trapped. The island was no longer a refuge. It was a prison. And the only way out, the only way to save himself, to save whatever remained of his sanity, seemed to be a path to utter annihilation. He had to go there. The hum in Dean's head sharpened, a drill bit boring into bone, each throb a fresh articulation of the abyssal hunger that now consumed the island. His grandfather's words, scrawled in a frantic, almost illegible hand on the last pages of the journal, echoed in his mind. A life. A willing surrender. The air in the small cottage felt dense, thick with an unseen presence, pressing against his eardrums until a faint ringing began. The implications were no longer abstract dread. They were a crushing, undeniable weight, settling deep in his chest. Outside, the world had begun to unravel. The fog, a constant companion on the island, had thickened into an opaque, churning wall that swallowed the lighthouse beam whole. It no longer smelled merely of salt and damp earth. A coppery metallic tang laced its vapor, sharp and acrid, like old blood mixed with brine. He could taste it on his tongue, a foul residue that made his stomach clench. The wind, which had always howled and shrieked, now carried a new guttural moan, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock beneath his feet. It was the island itself groaning, twisting under an unbearable strain. Dean walked to the window, his movements stiff, as if wading through unseen currents. Beyond the grimy pane, the familiar landscape had begun its grotesque transformation. The hardy coastal grasses, usually a resilient green, had withered to a sickly pale yellow, their stalks brittle and snapping in the unnatural gale. Patches of black, viscous goo pulsed at their roots, slowly expanding, consuming the earth. He saw it clinging to the rocks, glistening wetly, like obsidian tears weeping from the stone. He watched, horrified, as a gnarled, ancient tree, its branches usually bare and stoic, shuddered violently. His grandfather had outlined the sacrifice, yes, but also a means to sever the pact. His gaze fell upon the last coherent paragraph, penned with a trembling hand. The binding must be broken where it was forged. At the heart, the old stone, the remote monastery. The remote monastery. It was miles from the cottage, a journey that would be perilous even in fair weather, let alone this maelstrom. But there, his grandfather had written, lay the focal point, the intersection of the island's deep currents and the entity's burgeoning power. It was the only place where the ritual of severance could be performed. He began to gather what he needed. The journal itself, of course. A heavy, tarnished silver locket, his grandmother's, which his grandfather had mentioned in a cryptic note about purifying the conduit. A small, rusted iron lantern he'd found tucked away in a storage chest, its wick still intact. He filled a canvas bag with dried rations, a canteen of fresh water, and a coil of rope he kept for emergencies. He knew the way, having studied his grandfather's maps for years, meticulously tracing the faint lines and symbols. The hum in his head intensified, pressing in, trying to fracture his focus. It wanted him to break, to succumb, to become another vessel, another sacrifice. But the journal had given him a purpose beyond mere survival. It had given him the knowledge of what was at stake. Not just his life, but the island itself. Perhaps even something far greater. His grandfather's last entry had detailed the immense personal cost of the counter-ritual. It wasn't a simple incantation. It demanded a part of the self, a severing of the connection that the island's lineage had forged with the entity. A spiritual amputation, a profound, irreversible loss that would leave him empty. He would be irrevocably changed, scarred in a way no physical wound could mimic. A profound personal tragedy had brought him to this island, seeking solitude. He clutched the journal to his chest, its worn cover a fragile shield against the encroaching madness. The air vibrated with a low, resonant thrum, a sound that seemed to bypass his ears and resonate directly in his bones. The cottage groaned around him, timbers straining as if the very foundations were being wrenched from the earth. The only light now came from the churning, luminous fog outside, a sickly, greenish glow that promised nothing but malevolence. With a final, fortifying breath, Dean pushed open the cottage door, stepping out into the maelstrom. The wind tore at him, threatening to rip the coat from his shoulders. The metallic taste in the air was overwhelming. He looked towards the faint, distant outline of the northern cliffs, swallowed by the unnatural gloom. The remote monastery awaited. His heart hammered, not with fear alone, but with a fierce, desperate determination. He was ready. The wind, a mournful lament, clawed at Dean's oilskin, whipping his hair across his eyes as he trudged towards the remote monastery. Overhead, the sky was a bruised purple, heavy with unspoken threats. His grandfather's maps, faded and brittle, had pointed him here to this place of forgotten worship, tucked away in a desolate hollow on the island's northernmost tip. The structure emerged from the gloom like a skeletal hand reaching from the earth. Crumbling stone walls, hollow window frames that stared like vacant eyes, and a collapsed roof that spilled debris into the nave. His stomach churned with a mixture of revulsion and grim determination. This was where the answers lay, or at least the tools. He found it in the crypt beneath the main altar, a space choked with fallen masonry and the bones of long-dead monks. A small, water-stained parchment, tucked into a recess, detailed a ritual of binding, not of banishment. Dean's eyes scanned the ancient script, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't gold or a sacrifice of blood, but a tether, a connection, something personal. His grandfather hadn't sought to kill the thing, but to contain it. He understood then, with a sickening lurch, the true nature of the island's secret and the burden his ancestor had carried. The lighthouse wasn't just a beacon. It was the anchor point, the seal. The journey back was a torment. He saw shapes in the fog, indistinct and writhing, just at the periphery of his vision. The ground seemed to shift, the path coiling like a serpent ahead of him. His legs ached, his lungs burned, but Dean pushed on, the parchment clutched tight in his hand. The air inside was thick, charged with an unseen presence. The rhythmic creak of the machinery was gone, replaced by a low, guttural thrum that vibrated through the stone, through Dean's very bones. He could feel it now, the entity, fully manifested, a crushing weight of malevolence pressing in from all sides, eager to reclaim what it believed was its own. A frigid blast of air swept through the lantern room, though every window was sealed. The temperature plummeted, and Dean's breath plumed white. The thrum intensified, becoming a deafening roar that stole the air from his lungs. His mind screamed, telling him to flee, to surrender, that resistance was futile. But he held fast. He thought of his grandfather, of the strength it must have taken to live with this secret, to maintain the fragile peace. He unrolled the parchment, his hands trembling. The ritual was complex, involving a series of symbols to be etched into the very heart of the lighthouse and a final binding offering. The symbols, drawn from his grandfather's own blood, were already there, faded but still visible on the central mechanism of the lamp. Dean pulled a small, sharp knife from his pocket, a tool he usually used for carving maps. The parchment spoke of a tether to the world above, a living link to maintain the seal. He understood the sacrifice now. His freedom, his future, his very connection to the life he once knew, all would be offered. A wave of despair washed over him, threatening to drown him in its icy depths. He saw flashes of his past, of the life he'd lost, of the simple joys he'd once taken for granted. To sever himself from that, to become a permanent sentinel. With a guttural cry, Dean pressed the knife to his wrist. A sharp, searing pain, a crimson line blooming against his skin. He squeezed, letting the blood drip onto the faded symbols on the lamp's mechanism. As the warm, vital liquid touched the ancient markings, they flared with a faint, pulsing blue light. The thrumming intensified, but now there was a different note to it, a shriek of outrage, of something being denied. The lighthouse itself bucked, the stone groaning as if in protest. He pressed his bleeding wrist against the heart of the lamp, pouring his will, his grief, his desperate hope into the act. The blue light pulsed brighter, stronger, enveloping the entire mechanism. The entity roared, a sound that ripped through the very fabric of the air, a sound of immense power being forced back, contained. His vision blurred, the world tilting precariously. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the roar ceased. The viscous liquid on the glass was gone, leaving only streaks of clean water, as if the lighthouse itself had wept. The light, now steady and strong, beamed out into the clearing night, a solitary guardian against the vast, empty ocean. Dean collapsed, his legs giving out beneath him. He lay on the cold stone floor, his wrist throbbing, his body racked with exhaustion. He had done it. He had sealed the portal. He was bound, forever. A lighthouse keeper, not of light, but of the deep, a silent sentinel, his personal sacrifice complete. The island had claimed him, body and soul, a permanent fixture in its desolate, fog-shrouded embrace. He was no longer just Dean. He was the island's keeper and its prisoner. Overhead, the sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the promise of more tempest. He pushed against the gale, each step a testament to a resolve forged in the crucible of his recent terror. The thought of turning back, of simply surrendering to the encroaching tide of madness, had flickered, a desperate moth against the storm. But the pull towards this desolate sanctuary was stronger than any fear. He had to end it. At last, the monastery loomed, a hulking silhouette against the churning sky. Its stone walls, once meticulously crafted, were now ravaged by centuries of salt and wind, crumbling like an ancient forgotten tooth. Gaping windows, devoid of glass, stared out like vacant eyes. A heavy, iron-bound door, half-rotted and listing, hung ajar, inviting him into the suffocating silence within. Dean pushed the door further open. It groaned on rusted hinges, a sound that seemed to echo through the very foundations of the island. Inside, the light was a sickly gray, filtering through high, narrow slits. The interior was a cavernous nave, stripped bare of all adornment, save for the ghostly imprints on the walls where frescoes had once adorned them. His boots crunched on fallen plaster and grit. He moved deeper, his footsteps echoing unnervingly. The deep song, which had been a relentless roar in his mind, softened here, becoming a low, persistent hum beneath the floorboards, a vibration in the very air. It was still present, but subdued, as if the stones themselves were absorbing its malevolence. The walls were lined with crumbling alcoves, some holding the skeletal remains of what might have been ancient scholars, their robes long since turned to dust. At the end of the corridor, a faint, flickering light beckoned. He pressed on, his heart a frantic drumbeat beneath his ribs. The light led him to a small, circular chamber, its walls lined with shelves overflowing with brittle, leather-bound tomes. In the center, hunched over a heavy wooden table illuminated by a single sputtering oil lamp, sat an old man. He was impossibly ancient, his skin like dried parchment, his eyes a watery blue that seemed to hold the weight of millennia. He didn't look up immediately. It was inevitable. Dean felt a jolt of recognition, a primal certainty. This was the Keeper, the last guardian of the island's true history. "The Pact," Dean rasped, his throat dry. "What is it?" The elder slowly raised his gaze, meeting Dean's eyes. There was no surprise, no welcome, only a profound, weary understanding. "It is not a pact, young one," the elder clarified, his voice gaining a fragile strength. "It is a vigil, a sacrifice. For generations, a bloodline has been bound to this island, to the light. Your grandfather and his father before him. The lighthouse," he revealed, was not just a beacon against the storm, but a focal point for a powerful ward, a deep resonance meant to lull the entity, to keep it dreaming beneath the waves. The Keepers, like Dean's grandfather, were not just guardians of the light, but living anchors for this ward, their presence, their very consciousness, feeding the countersong that kept the deep song subdued. Dean's grandfather, in his final days, had succumbed, his mind fractured by the relentless hum, and the ward had faltered. The entity had begun to stir, reaching out, calling for a new anchor, a new consciousness to bind it. It had called Dean. "Your blood carries the resonance," the elder continued, his voice barely audible now. "You were drawn here, not by chance, but by the entity's need for a new anchor, a new mind to sing its lullaby. The ward must be renewed." He understood now. The elder pointed to the open book. "You must accept the burden. You must become the light, the song's counterpoint. You will return to the lighthouse. You will hear its call, always, but you must not answer. You must become a wall against its hunger. Dean stared at the ancient text, its symbols seeming to writhe and shift in the dim light. His choices were stark: succumb to the entity and be consumed, or embrace this horrifying legacy, this eternal vigil. He thought of his grandfather, of the madness that had claimed him, and a grim resolve hardened within Dean. He would not break. He would not let it consume anyone else. He took a deep, shuddering breath. "Show me," he said, his voice firm, echoing in the desolate chamber. "Show me what I must do." The elder nodded slowly, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. He rose, incredibly frail, and led Dean to a small, hidden alcove behind the shelves. There, a small, intricate carving of the island and its lighthouse was etched into the stone, glowing faintly with an inner light. The elder placed Dean's hand on the carving. It was contained. It was his to manage. When Dean finally left the remote monastery, the wind still howled, but it felt different, less threatening. The sky was still bruised, but a sliver of pale light had pierced the heavy clouds. He carried the knowledge of the deep song, not as a curse, but as a burden he had chosen. He was the guardian now, bound to the island, to the lighthouse, to the endless vigil against the ancient hunger. He would never truly be free, never truly escape. He was the anchor, the countersong, and the deep song, he knew, would always be waiting just beneath the waves, just beneath the surface of his own mind.